This one's gonna be crazy. You got a handful of insane, campy, beautifully batshit wild Sam Raimi films stacked up against some movies that are directed by Sam Raimi. What's up, everybody? Well, with the release of Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness this past weekend, we now have 15 films to talk about directed by Sam Raimi. Legendary filmmaker Sam Raimi. I did not include his first picture, the one that he did that was kind of his precursor to Evil Dead that he made as a student film with Bruce Campbell. To be honest with you, I doubt any of you have seen it anyway, and I could not find a copy of it to save my life. So we're talking about the Evil Dead Onward. And with that being said, let's kick it off with number 15, which is easily my least favorite of his films. Not a bad movie, but one that I could never see myself watching again, and that is Oz the Great and Powerful. Bit of a bombshell. I'm one of the 8 people on planet Earth that does not love The Wizard of Oz. I'm not really a musical guy, so I don't even really have that element going into this. Like, let's see how things are set up for that classic movie. I really just did not care. I watched this, I said, okay, fantasy world, a little bit of a Tim Burton vibe to it. I love James Franco. You know, it's a shame that things worked out the way that they did and he had the past that he did. I wish I could see him in more movies, but nonetheless, I like him on screen. And beyond that, it just bored me. I didn't care. I didn't care about who was going to be the Wicked Witch of the West. I thought it was obvious anyway. I didn't care about the princess in the bubble and whether or not she became the ruler of Oz. I didn't care whether or not Oz got to actually find happiness. It was a story that did not speak to me. It's well made. I could see people that love Wizard of Oz maybe taking a liking to it, but for me, I was bored. I would never watch it again. Number 14 is a movie called Crime Wave. Now, this was very early Sam Raimi. This is still when he could not fund pictures very well. He was working with the Coen brothers, and he came up with this movie that is something. It's almost like a crime caper told through the eyes of the Three Stooges. It's meant to be campy and goofy and slapstick in all of the most classic ways. And so I could see a very small niche group of people adoring this movie for that. For me, it was just too goofy. It was too weird. And I could see what he was going for. I get it. But it's not the type of movie that really entertains me. The voices of the villains obviously being overdubbed with ADR and kind of fiddled with the pitch a little bit. You got one of them, it's like and then you got the other one who's Ponytail from Tango and Cash, and he's like The only reason that it's not my number 15 is because it was so memorable for being bad and just ridiculous. I could watch that again just for the hell of it, just to make fun of it, or just to even do a review on it and talk about how weird and unique it is. So it at least stood out a little bit more than Oz. Number 13 is going to be For Love of the Game. Perfectly fine, passable, competently made baseball romance movie. I believe this is the third baseball romance movie that Kevin Costner has done. I love Kevin Costner. I absolutely adore Kelly Preston, God rest her soul. So you have the 2 leads that are the subject of this romance. Easily I can get into it. I can watch the story and I can be invested in their love. Not a big sports guy. I love a good sports movie, but this one is more about the romance. It's the last game of Kevin Costner's career. He's, this pitcher who's about to retire. He's in the middle of pitching the best game he's ever done in his life, and the movie splices in these memories of how he met Kelly Preston and the trials and tribulations of their relationship while he is pitching this game. And so the sports stuff was fine, the romance stuff was fine, and so you have a movie that's just fine. Number 12 is The Gift. Now, this is a movie that should really appeal to a lot of Sam Raimi's directing style and the way that he likes to go bonkers, the way that he likes to go out there, and even just using the way that he zooms and uses different angles with the camera can always heighten supernatural type stories like this. You got Cate Blanchett, who's like this small southern town's psychic. She's the tarot card reader, and there is a missing woman and then eventually a murder and a trial. And so you have all these different characters in this little southern town, and it kind of plays out almost like a soap opera. They all have different ties and different secrets. Now, I will say the movie's got a phenomenal cast. I mean, Cate Blanchett, you got Keanu Reeves giving one of, if not his best performances, really against typecast for him. Katie Holmes, always liked her. Greg Kinnear, you even got J.K. Simmons. I mean, all over the place is like, holy shit, man, this is like a star cast. This would be like an Oscar picture nowadays would get a cast like this. And unfortunately, the story is just vanilla. It just doesn't really go anywhere. It doesn't really go anywhere wild or crazy or unique. If you've seen any kind of a murder mystery or anything like this that came out in that Sixth Sense era, you pretty much can tell where everything is going within the first act of the movie. And so while the acting certainly lifts this above what it could be, it felt like Sam Raimi's restraint on himself to not go full Sam Raimi actually hurt the movie. And unfortunately, you have a movie like this that, despite having tons of star power, its only legacy is one thing.
We ain't going nowhere. Supposedly Katie Holmes shows her titties in this movie.
Number 11 is Darkman. Now, this is the one on this list I was looking forward to watching the most because I've never seen the Darkman movies and I've always been intrigued by them. And you have essentially this movie that came out in the era with 1989 Batman and Dick Tracy, and Sam Raimi created his own comic book style character played by Liam Neeson. You pretty much have my ass in the seat just by telling me that. And so you have this very simple revenge tale about a doctor who is murdered and stuck into these like chemicals by these gangsters, and he lives through it and has superhuman strength. He's impervious to pain, and he was also working on this synthetic skin, so he's able to cover up all of his chemical scars with fake Mission Impossible masks. And so he goes and just starts to fuck with all these gangsters and gets revenge on them using these masks. Very cool concept. I didn't think the movie ever really matched up to its concept though. It's got that classic Sam Raimi style. It's got all of his signature stuff here. The way that he moves the camera, the campiness, the music by Danny Elfman, even just some things that he has in the background that's clearly green screen. It's one of the most Sam Raimi movies on this list. And Liam Neeson, I think, was a very good pick for the lead role. Maybe I saw it too late. Maybe it's a movie that would have appealed to me much more if I saw it when I was a kid and grew up with it and saw it in the era that it was still a pretty fresh new thing. Watching it for the first time in 2022, it was okay. It was something I understand the fan base for it. I'm not necessarily motivated to watch the other two, especially since Liam Neeson's not even in those and Sam Raimi didn't direct them. Number 10 was the last movie that I watched on this list, and that was The Quick and the Dead. I remember my dad watching this a few times back in the 90s when it came out, and so certain scenes I do remember. But it's a movie I had never seen before a couple days ago. And it's a very solid 90s action-centric Western. It's a small town. You got Gene Hackman, who is the guy that basically holds over the entire town. He's the gunman that just keeps everybody in fear. And they have this little shootout contest, this gunslinger contest, to where you have everybody sign up, and every single day, 2 by 2, they go, and one person walks away alive, one person walks away dead, until the winner comes and he gets all the money, which is presumed to be Gene Hackman every single time that he holds this contest. But Sharon Stone is this mysterious drifter that comes into town, signs up for the contest. She's only known as the Lady, and throughout the movie you find out that she has this trauma in her past, this motivation for why she wants to kill Gene Hackman. You got Russell Crowe here as a guy who had a crisis of faith when he was a huge gunslinger criminal and became a preacher, and now he's shoved back into the gunslinger life. Leo DiCaprio, very young, of course. It's actually got some of that signature Sam Raimi camera work, like whenever they have the little high noon thing and they're waiting for the clock to strike 12, and you get the camera zooms on different people's faces to rise the tension until kapow, they both shoot at each other. He adds his style where he can, but it still very much feels like a Western. It doesn't feel like this crazy campy Sam Raimi movie that just takes place in the Wild West. And so there's good and bad that comes along with that. I was entertained by it. I thought that there was enough violence. Could have used a little bit more. A little bit more of that Evil Dead gore could have helped along just a bit if you're going to go for just the shootouts. But while I don't watch Westerns a lot, when I do watch them, I like ones that have a little bit more of a dramatic side to it, a little bit more of a grounded, real-world flavor to it. This one definitely has a little bit of camp, a little bit of heightened Hollywood sense to it. And so while I was entertained, I did like this movie. It's not one that I could see myself going back and rewatching very often. This is the point in the ranking where we separate the men from the boys. You got all the movies that I just talked about that some I didn't like, but many of them down below, solid movies that I had a good enough time with. The ones above here, even the one that I'm just about to mention at number 9, these are all movies that I rewatch at least once a year or once every couple of years. These are all significantly higher in the echelon of movie fandom for me than everything that I've said below it. Coming in at number 9 for me is going to be Evil Dead 2: Dead by Dawn. Now, I know there's a lot of you Evil Dead fans out there that are losing their mind right now that I just said that. But hear me out. I do like the Evil Dead franchise, but I'm a casual fan of it. It's never been one of my favorites. It's a franchise that I enjoy, especially when I'm in the mood for it, but it's never one of my go-tos. And every single time that I rewatch this franchise, as much as I can't figure out why I'm on opposite ends of Earth with most of the Evil Dead fandom, this one is always the one that I like to revisit the least. I like this movie a lot. Like I said, I rewatch it a lot. But for me, the recap sense of the first film always bugs me. The amount of slapstick here while trying to be very much grounded in horror never completely comes together. I like what they do. I think that the effects and what Sam Raimi was able to do with a low budget, and certainly Bruce Campbell and his crazy performance as Ash, all of that stuff is awesome. I get it. I love all of that. But I like my Evil Dead films to either be straight up horror, like the original film to an extent and the remake, or full-on slapstick comedy like Army of Darkness. This one tries to do both, and I don't feel like it reaches the heights of either of those for me personally. So while it's fun, while it's a good time, while it's certainly iconic as hell and has a gigantic legacy amongst horror and especially Sam Raimi and Evil Dead fans, this is a film that I like, but have never loved. And now I'm about to get in real trouble. Number 8 for me is actually gonna be Spider-Man 3. Now, I am one of those people, I've just genuinely never understood the level of hate that this movie gets. It's obviously the most flawed of the 3. I get most of the criticisms towards it. I just don't get the level of criticism towards it. Yes, there was a big power struggle going on between Raimi and Sony to where Sony wanted Sandman, or Sony wanted Venom, Raimi wanted Sandman, and rather than compromise their egos or compromise their visions, they compromised the movie and tried to squish both of them together. Sandman came out okay in that exchange. Venom got completely screwed over. Fan favorite character, not the best choice. Totally agree with that. There's some shoddy CGI in this movie. Absolutely. The dance sequence, I love the walking through the street section of it. I don't like when it picks up a second time inside of the jazz club, so I get that. Certainly could have done without, once again, having Mary Jane be kind of the most pain in the ass girlfriend in the world. And there is some logic issues here and there with things that they kind of shoved into the movie to make sense, like the butler having known all along that his father was Green Goblin. Things like that. Totally valid. But for me, when you look past those flaws, you still have a very solid, very well written, and a very well themed final chapter in the Raimi trilogy. A trilogy that I adore. The other 2 films will be high on this list. I love this character, I love Spider-Man, and I love Raimi's trilogy as a whole. You have this theme of forgiveness throughout this movie where Peter has to learn to forgive Sandman as well as Harry. Harry has to learn to forgive Peter. Mary Jane has to learn to forgive Peter and Harry, and I think it all comes together in a really nice, cohesive way. It's a very heartfelt third act for me when friends finally come back together to defeat the evil and leads to some sacrifices. I really love all of that. I think that the Sandman storyline, despite not liking the fact that they have to retcon the first movie a bit to make it work, overall, he's a very effective villain that I do like. And while Venom gets completely fucked over, I like all of the black suit symbiote stuff. I like the corruption of Peter. I like the darkness of Peter coming out and all of that. Even the way that it's embodied in a very campy, goofy way in the walking down the street and having a very false sense of cockiness. I get a lot of the humor that he was going for there. I do not hate that sequence. So while I know a lot of you are flabbergasted that I had that this high on this list, especially above Evil Dead 2, I'm just being honest with you. I watched Spider-Man 3. I always enjoy this movie. every single time. Number 7 is going to be Drag Me to Hell. Now this is a total underrated classic in the horror genre. This was Sam Raimi going right back to his Evil Dead roots, coming out of nowhere with this movie that's just so batshit crazy and so zany and campy, while at the same time being pretty creepy, very over the top with a lot of the horror sequences and genuinely kind of getting underneath your skin. You have this girl that's cursed by this gypsy witch, and then she's trying to break this curse the entire movie, and the way that it ends is just absolutely perfect. I mean, there's not a whole lot negative I can say about this movie, really. It might be too campy and too crazy for some, it might be too horrific for some, but where Evil Dead 2 always kind of struggled to balance both of those for my own personal taste, this one actually balances them quite well. Number 6 is Army of Darkness. Now this is the only one of the Evil Dead movies that I actually grew up watching as a kid. I had this VHS tape with some other movie and Army of Darkness, and I don't even think I remembered what the name was because the label on the VHS was always kind of scuffed. I just knew which one it was. But so many sequences in this movie I watched as a kid and I loved, and there was this lost period to where VHS tapes went away, we had DVD and all of that, and there was probably a good 10 or 15 years that I did not watch this movie. And when I first watched Evil Dead and Evil Dead 2, I didn't like them when I was young. And so as a teenager, I finally watched the trilogy again, and when I got to Army of Darkness, I was like, holy shit, this is that movie! Where the campiness and the slapstick humor of Evil Dead 2 never fully came together for me. I genuinely laughed my ass off in Army of Darkness. The sequence where he, is burying the severed head and throws dirt in his face, I always laugh. Whenever he's got the little tiny versions of Ash and he's stomping his feet around trying to get him and they stab him with a nail and his reaction. It's one of the few slapstick movies that actually hits my funny bone. Still has some really good action in it as well. I like the whole medieval theme of it. It's not as gory, not as, full-on horror or bloody or rated R as a lot of the other Evil Dead movies or the other Sam Raimi movies, but I still have a lot of fun with this action-adventure spin on the Evil Dead franchise. And coming up right above that is The Evil Dead. Now, this is a movie that, like I said, when I first watched it when I was like 12, 13 years old, it didn't work for me. I don't know. It had to be in the right mood, I guess. Something that I was expecting was not what I saw on screen. When I watched it later on, I've watched this trilogy of movies probably about a dozen times at this point in my life. Evil Dead has slowly rose through the ranks of the Sam Raimi Evil Dead movies to be my favorite of them because it has everything that a lot of people love Evil Dead 2 for, which is the low budget creativity, the Sam Raimi isms, the way that he moves the camera around, all the practical effects. But this one, while having some slapstick to it, while certainly having some campiness to it, this one is still a straight up horror film, and I think it works better for that. It has all the creativity and all of the practical effects and everything that impressed me with Evil Dead 2, but I'm almost more impressed because this was even on a smaller budget and an even less experienced filmmaker. I think that the randomness of Ash being the one to rise to be the final guy, the final girl by the end of it, is a little bit more of an interesting story for me versus him being the centerpiece of it in the second film. And so for some reason, I've just always gravitated more towards this one. This classic story with his girlfriend and his two friends and the demonic presence coming through and the chick getting violated in the woods and the chick underneath the floor and even the doll face thing. Not another peep. That stuff is just classic for me. I really do like going back to the Evil Dead more than I like going back to Army of Darkness or Evil Dead 2. Just a matter of preference. Now, before I get to my top 4, guys, if you enjoyed this ranking, please check out my playlist of all of my director rankings. I've done Christopher Nolan, Tarantino, I've done Michael Bay. Recently, I did the M. Night Shyamalan and James Wan. I've done quite a few of them. So if you like this format, you like rankings talking about a director's filmography, I even did Wes Craven last month, all 22 of that man's movies. So please check out this playlist below and watch all of those rankings as well. Hope you enjoyed them. And now the top 4 Sam Raimi films. Number 4 is the one that has the most potential to go up and down on this list because it's brand new, and that is Doctor Strange, Multiverse of Madness. Guys, I really like this movie. I mean, the more I think about it, the more I talk about it with other people, the more that I kind of have this discourse online or on Twitter about certain criticisms against it and people saying it should have been rated R. Shut up. I really, really dig this movie. I mean, I said in my review that if they had gone a little further with the Sam Raimi horror stuff, it would have made my top 5. who the hell knows, when all's said and done, this might creep up into that top 5 at some point, because the way that this story played out between Doctor Strange and Scarlet Witch, the way that Sam Raimi, a very rare thing in the MCU in my opinion, was able to full on make this his movie. There's some MCU stuff here that's certainly templated, but there's so much of this movie that is just classic Sam Raimi that it really just tickled me to death. I loved seeing the sequence with Scarlet Witch coming through the reflections and just a total like demonic style character. I loved the whole third act to where he has to reanimate the dead Doctor Strange and he creates the cloak out of the demons and the spirits of the dead. Like all that stuff just speaks to me so much. I'm like, dude, the MCU, more of this shit, please. Action sequences were really good. They actually had a tempered level of the MCU template and the MCU formula and the MCU humor that I'm really starting to get a bit burnout on, despite how much I love this universe. And overall, just the story of Scarlet Witch and the performance of Elizabeth Olsen just knocked this movie out of the park. I thought she was awesome. I thought the way they utilized her character was awesome. She was so horrific and so terrifying and so ruthless. And yet you always sympathized with her. There was always a piece of your brain that understood, even a piece of your brain that might have even rooted for her, because all of her motivations were steeped in a mother's love. Coming out the weekend of Mother's Day is a bit of a sick joke, by the way, but yeah, it was a movie that I didn't have very much expectation for. I figured this might be fun to see what Sam Raimi can do here and there. We'll probably see him for 10 minutes of this movie. The rest of it will look like anybody could have directed it. I was shocked how much a Sam Raimi fan and an Evil Dead fan like me can watch this movie and just get a kick out of it. Number 3 is going to be A Simple Plan. By far, by a country mile, the best of the normal Sam Raimi movies. The ones where he's not going for these crazy style and camp and out there concepts. This is a straight up classic Hitchcockian paranoia style thriller, where you have two brothers and a friend stumble upon this crashed plane full of drugs. There's a bag full of $4 million. They take it from the plane and vow to let things die down, see where the chips fall before they split up the money. And one by one, things start to happen within the town, within these three people, within their families, to where secrets are coming out and paranoia is coming out and betrayals and allegiances, to where it just turns into an absolute disaster. You got Bill Paxton, you got Billy Bob Thornton, who I believe was even nominated for an Oscar for this movie. He's fantastic in this. I mean, you got Gary Cole, you've got so many other, Bridget Fonda. You'll recognize a lot of the actors in here, and every single one of them are damn good. And it's because of their level of dedication, especially Billy Bob's, that draws a lot of these human emotions out of this story, because something so simple and so grounded like this, told through the eyes of Sam Raimi, you would expect it to go in these batshit directions and just go way over the top, and they really don't. Where it goes over the top is how far things go wrong. Just the simplest misunderstanding or the simplest betrayal just leads to a bloodbath in certain senses, or the simplest little bit of paranoia can lead to all of these inferences, all these different little conclusions that people come to about what must be going on with that person, and it's just a wild ride to watch. I was genuinely surprised with this movie. I never hear anybody talk about it, and I'm gonna try to change that, because this is certainly a movie that I'm gonna recommend to a lot of people. If you like those classic paranoia thrillers, this to me is a must watch. I highly enjoyed it. Now, if you watched me for a while, my top 2 shouldn't be much of a surprise, because like I've said, even in this video, I adore the Spider-Man movies. My number 2 is going to be the original Spider-Man from 2002. I remember seeing this. This was a great day. I got my PlayStation 2 that I've been wanting for months. I was playing Metal Gear Solid 2 Sons of Liberty for the first time. I think my grandma even brought me like my favorite food from the restaurant that used to be in Ohio where I used to live. And then me and my dad, when he got off work, we were going to see Spider-Man. It was just like one of those days where I'm like, man, God, you're just raining down blessings upon me today. And so Spider-Man was back in that era where up to this point we really only had Blade, of which very few people even realized was a comic book movie, and then you had X-Men. Pretty much all other comic book movies for the past 10 years, with the exception of maybe 1 or 2, were all dog shit. And so you had Sam Raimi come out with Spider-Man, one of the biggest, most popular superheroes of all time. You had these huge trailers, all this fan hype, all this buzz, and you go and see it, and it was like, oh my God, this is what a comic book movie can do. It's dated for some now that it's, 20 years later, and some people don't like it, don't like the camp, don't like the classic style that he brought to it, but at the time of release, this was like mind-blowing. This was something that set a new precedent, set a new benchmark for what comic book movies could be and what they should be. And I have always loved this movie for that. I love Tobey Maguire in the role, and I didn't know who the hell he was before this. I was still young and stupid. I'm like, I don't know you. You can't be Spider-Man. And I watched this, and he was perfect. I love James Franco in the role of Harry. Of course, I think this is the best that we ever got out of Kirsten Dunst, and this role was in this first film. And Willem Dafoe as Green Goblin, even before we saw him in No Way Home, he just nails this. He was one of the most perfect comic book on-screen villains at the time. And so, great casting all the way around, and Sam Raimi did a great job at bringing this classic, campy, comic book style to it. It literally felt like a movie that just leapt off of the pages, and not too often anymore do you have a distinct style like that. And despite being a guy who is known much more for horror and dramas and things like that, the action sequences were all pretty damn awesome in this movie, especially at the time. And the special effects were all awesome. The way that he could just realize web swinging on screen, it was like, holy shit, he actually did it. So this is a movie that I do think fits into that category of you had to be there to a certain extent. I still think that there's a lot of timeless appeal to this. I do think that there is certain comic book fans, certain movie fans that can watch this movie for the first time today and understand and appreciate a lot of the things that it did back in the day. But for me, because I was there day one and I have watched it continuously since then, and I still hold it as one of my favorite comic book films of all time, just this entire trilogy means so much to me. But my number one is Spider-Man 2. Legitimately in my top 10 comic book films of all time. Maybe even top 5, I'd have to sit down and do it. But everything that I just said about Spider-Man 1 is done better in Spider-Man 2. You have a better villain, if you could even believe that, with how amazing Willem Dafoe is. Alfred Molina as Doc Ock is still my favorite villain of the Spider-Man movies, even to this day. Even with the 3 iterations of Spider-Man that we have gotten, I think he nailed it. He was perfect. I love the action sequences here, the fight on top of the train, and then the impending, like, trying to stop the train is one of the most amazing sequences in any comic book film in my mind. I love the drama in this, to where Peter is really toying with whether or not he wants to be Spider-Man, and if he is Spider-Man, whether or not he wants to be with Mary Jane while he is Spider-Man, whether or not he wants to tell her that he's Spider-Man. So much of that love drama going throughout this could have easily had been melodramatic, could have easily been corny, but I love the way that it does, and it really does tug on the heartstrings, especially the first time that I saw it. By the time he finally reveals himself and she sees why they've had all the trouble that they've had, and finally is like, oh my God, that everything makes much more sense now. I think I teared up the first time that I saw it. So Spider-Man 2, I've reviewed every single one of the Spider-Man films. If you guys like those, I will put a playlist up here of those, so go see my more in-depth thoughts. But Spider-Man 2, I legitimately think is one of the greatest comic book films ever made. To this day, I still believe that, and it is my number one Sam Raimi film. All right, guys, if you enjoyed this video, please click over here and check out my director rankings. And I'm also going to put my recent review of Doctor Strange Multiverse of Madness over here, so you can check out all my in-depth thoughts on that. Thank you for watching so much. Please like and share this video if you enjoyed it. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss anything in the future. And as always, guys, remember, opinions are like assholes, but that doesn't mean that you have to be.